The dust on Dry Creek's main road rose like smoke that afternoon, curling around boots and hooves and laughter that didn't belong to kindness. The air shimmered with heat, and even the horses tied outside the saloon seemed tired of listening. A young woman walked down that street, her hands folded in front of her, her eyes lowered as though the world itself might hurt to look at. Her name was Clara Mae Donnelly, though most folks in town said it like an apology or a punchline. They used to laugh when she passed, the old ones would later say, not because she did wrong, but because she reminded them of what they feared most, being unloved. Clara's dress was faded lilac, the seams pulling a little at her waist. Her shoes were worn through, and her shawl hung like a tired bird's wing. Still, she moved with a quiet grace that didn't fit the cruel whispers that followed her. Folks said she was soft, slow, big as two girls together. But they never said what else she was: gentle, forgiving, and faithful to a world that had given her little reason to be the boarding house. She cleaned rooms for travelers who rarely noticed her. Sometimes they left coins on the table, sometimes crumbs. She collected both with equal gratitude. Her father, once the town's blacksmith, coughed in the nights now, too weak to lift the hammer he'd swung for 30 years. She prayed for him by candlelight, though even her prayers had grown small, like a whisper afraid to wake hope. In Dry Creek, laughter was its own currency. And that week, gossip became the game again. Martha Lyle, who ran the general store and believed herself the moral keeper of the town, leaned across her counter one morning and said, "We ought to send that Donnelly girl up to Boone's ranch. Tell her he needs his barn cleaned." Tommy Pike, the stable hand too young to know decency, laughed so hard he nearly dropped his broom. "She'll sink in the mud before she gets there," he snorted. "Or scare his horses clean out the pasture. Let's see if he takes her in," Martha smirked. "Could use a bit of humor in these dry days." So the word spread like wildfire in a thirsty field. By noon, half the town knew. By sundown, Clara knew too, only not the joke behind it. She heard it secondhand, from a woman passing by the boarding house. "Elias Boone needs someone to clean his barn," the woman said. "Pays fair. Lost his wife last spring. Might take kindly to a helper." Clara pressed her hands to her apron. "Truly," she whispered. "Truly," came the answer, as though she prepared the next morning as if for church. She mended her dress, brushed her hair smooth, packed a small bundle with bread and apples, and set out before dawn. The road stretched 6 miles to the Boone Ranch, cutting through low hills and wild grass bent by the wind. The sun came up behind her, turning her shadow long and soft. She walked slowly, her breath short but steady, her hands blistering on the rope that held her bundle. Every few miles, she stopped to catch her breath and listen, to birds, to wind, to the quiet ache in her chest that said maybe this time it will be different. The Boone Ranch appeared near noon, rising from the land like a memory half forgotten. Fences leaned tiredly but still held. The barn door was open, the scent of hay and horse heavy in the air. A lone man stood by the corral, mending a bridle. Elias Boone was a man built by work and silence, the kind whose words came slow but landed true. His beard was grayer than his years, his hands large and nicked from a lifetime of rope and steel. When Clara's shadow fell across his boots, he looked up, steady, unreadable. "Mr. Boone," she said softly, "they told me you needed help with your barn." He said nothing for a long time, only watched the way her fingers trembled around the rope, how her face flushed with effort and shyness. Then he nodded once. "Ain't no harm in help," he said. "You know your way around a shovel?" She nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." "Then start there." So she did. The first thing she did was sweep. Her back ached almost at once, but she didn't stop. The horses shifted uneasily, their eyes wide at the stranger. She whispered to them as she worked. "It's all right, boys. Just me. Won't hurt you none." Her voice, uncertain at first, grew calm. The sound of her humming filled the barn, an old hymn her mother used to sing when rain was due. From the doorway, Elias watched. The barn, once quiet as a grave, felt alive again. Dust rose and caught in the sunlight streaming through the slats. He saw her pause once, press her hand to her side, then keep going. There was no complaint, no sigh, only the steady rhythm of someone who'd known harder days and found peace in the doing. When the sun began to fall, Elias brought her a plate, stew and cornbread, still warm. She froze when he offered it. "Sir, I don't mean to trouble, He set it down beside her anyway. You worked for it. Clara looked at the plate, then at him, her eyes wide as if she'd never been offered something freely. Thank you, she whispered. He tipped his hat, turned away, and said, You can come back tomorrow, if you want. She nodded, but he didn't see it. After he left, she ate under the soft light of a hanging lantern, tears sliding down her cheeks so quietly the horses didn't stir. Outside, the prairie wind brushed through the grass. Later, Elias stood on the porch of his cabin, watching her figure disappear down the road, small against the wide horizon. He didn't know her story, nor did he ask. But something in the way she worked, gentle, deliberate, unashamed, unsettled the quiet he'd grown used to. The narrator's voice lowers to a murmur, like the telling of an old truth. Sometimes two souls meet not in the blaze of passion or the promise of beauty, but in the hush of labor shared. Sometimes, mercy doesn't arrive as rescue, but as recognition. That night, both lay awake under different roofs. The man remembering laughter he hadn't heard in years, the woman remembering kindness she'd thought the world had forgotten. Clara returned to the Boone ranch the next morning before the sun had cleared the ridges. Dew clung to her hem, and the air smelled of wet grass and horses breathing slow. Elias was already in the yard, breaking ice from the trough. He looked up when he heard her boots on the gravel, but didn't speak. Just nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement that she had kept her word. She began where she left off, sweeping the corners of the barn until light pooled like gold dust across the floorboards. The rhythm steadied her heart. She'd thought all night about the strange peace she'd felt, working beside a man who never mocked, never looked away. It made her wonder if kindness could live that quietly in someone's eyes and still be real. Days turned to weeks. The barn changed with her touch. Tools hung in neat rows. Stalls smelled of pine oil and clean hay. The horses grew calm around her, pressing their warm muzzles against her shoulder. Elias noticed. He said little, but sometimes she caught him watching as she brushed a mare's coat or carried a bucket too heavy for her frame. He'd take it wordlessly from her hand, lift it as if it weighed nothing, and set it down beside her again. Once, in late afternoon, he asked, You always hum when you work? She looked startled, then smiled. I don't mean to. My ma used to say music keeps the heart steady. Seems to work, he said, returning to his fence post. The world of Dry Creek continued to turn, and gossip never rested. People noticed Clara walking out to Boone's place most mornings, her stride surer now, her dress brushed clean. Martha Law watched from her porch and muttered to a neighbor, Poor fool must think she's found herself a husband. Tommy Pike laughed, spitting tobacco in the dust. Boone's just too polite to send her home. When Clara came into town for supplies, she felt their eyes on her, their whispers following. But she didn't lower her gaze this time. Something in her had begun to lift, like soil turning towards sunlight after long rain. Elias had paid her fair wages, in coins that clinked warm in her palm. Not charity. Work. She bought flour and salt. Even a ribbon for her hair, a small blue one that matched the sky she'd started noticing again. The connection between her and Elias deepened the way a trail deepens under repeated steps, slow. Unspoken, sure. He began to talk more, telling her about his late wife, how she'd loved the sound of rain on the tin roof. Clara listened with quiet reverence. In return, she spoke of her father, his cough, her fears of losing the only person who had ever truly needed her. One evening, when the work was done, Elias saddled his gentlest horse and asked, You ever ridden before? She hesitated. No, sir. Don't reckon I'd fit well. He shook his head. Horse don't care about that. Only about trust. So he helped her up, his hands steady at her waist. The moment her feet left the ground, something inside her lifted too, weightless, free. He led the horse slowly along the fence line, walking beside her as the sun melted into the plains. Her laughter came sudden and bright, startling even her. Elias looked up at the sound, and for the first time in years, he smiled without sorrow shadowing it. That night, after she'd gone home, he sat by the barn door long after dark, listening to the wind whistle through the eaves. He couldn't name what had changed, only that the ranch no longer felt empty. But Dry Creek had a way of resenting peace. One afternoon, Clara brought supplies back from town, a sack of oats, a few nails, and that blue ribbon now tied in her hair. She found Elias outside the general store. settling accounts with Martha Lyle. The woman's lips twisted as she saw Clara approach. Well, look who's found herself some pride, Martha said loud enough for the porch crowd to hear. Barn work must be finer than I thought. How's Boone's house these days, Clara? Cleaned it top to bottom, have you? A few men chuckled. Tommy Pike tipped his hat mockingly. Maybe Boone's just lonely, eh, boss? Big ranch gets mighty quiet at night. The laughter rolled through the air like dust devils. Clara froze, color rising in her cheeks. She opened her mouth, but no words came. The humiliation burned through her like fever. Elias turned slowly. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his hand. His voice came low and even, like distant thunder. She's the best worker this town's got, he said. This ranch stands because of her hands. You all talk mighty loud for folks who've never done an honest day's work beside her. The porch went still. Tommy's smirk faltered. Martha looked away, suddenly busy with her ledger. Elias stepped closer, eyes steady. You think you're laughing at her, but you're just showing what you are. He tipped his hat to Clara and said, Come on, let's go. They walked away together, silence thick between them, but it was not shame this time. It was something heavier and truer, respect. Back at the ranch, she stood by the barn door, tears glistening in her eyes. You didn't have to do that, she whispered. He leaned against the post, wiping his hands on his gloves. Didn't seem right not to. The dusk settled around them, soft as breath. He looked at her then, not as a charity case or a burden, but as someone whose quiet strength had rebuilt not just his barn, but his life. I don't talk much, he said after a while. Never saw much point in it. But I see you, Clara. You belong here. If you want to stay. Her voice trembled. Stay. He nodded once. Barn's cleaner when you're around. Horses calmer. Place feels like home again. She swallowed, the ache in her throat sweet as it was strange. I'd like that, she said softly. Morning came with lights spilling through the barn slats, warm and golden. Clara was already at work, her figure framed by the doorway, hair loose, ribbon catching the breeze. The horses moved around her easily, their hooves a steady rhythm on the straw. Elias stood by the gate, watching her, the corners of his mouth turning upward. The narrator's voice closes in a tone of old memory. In a town that made laughter its weapon, a cruel joke became a story of grace. He offered her a place not out of pity, but because he saw what the world refused to see, the beauty of quiet endurance. Sometimes, redemption doesn't come as thunder or miracles. Sometimes it arrives softly, like a woman sweeping a barn until morning light finds her face and calls it beautiful. And maybe that's all we're ever meant to learn, that one act of decency, held steady against the wind of mockery, can build a home stronger than any wall of pride.